carbon capture farm. We can see that and a spade full of soil.
Yes.
Right. Well, the first thing that I wanted to say, can we now see the second one that says short rotation forestry?
We sure can.
Fantastic. Okay, so I noticed that Minister Hackett was mentioning something about forestry. I gather there's some kind of a controversy about forestry in Ireland. We certainly have controversy about short rotation forestry in Australia and also in New Zealand. And this has previously been promoted as carbon neutral or a renewable resource, but the evidence now shows that short rotation forestry actually emits far more carbon to the atmosphere than it sequesters. So while trees are actively growing, they are certainly taking carbon out of the atmosphere, but once they're harvested, they lose it again. And then there is all of the energy that's used in, in preparing the site and also in maintaining the plants and the harvesting, processing, all of those kinds of things. So harvested wood products have a limited lifespan, and some of the data on that is that the half-life of solid wood, for example, when it's used as timber, is about 30 years, while paper and paperboard have a half-life of about 2 years. And if the wood is used for some kind of fuel or bioenergy, it's actually treated as an instantaneous emission. And when we look at all of those decay curves for different usages of timber from short rotation forestry, we see that the net effect is that the carbon stored in the harvested wood products is actually returned to the atmosphere in far less time than it takes to grow the trees. Now, what this means is that if you wanted to, if you had a net sequestration benefit from your first round of forestry, you would actually have to then plant a larger area to trees each time. So because all of the carbon that's stored in the trees is then lost after they've been harvested and used for various purposes. And then all the preparation, planting, maintenance, harvesting, transport and everything is an extra carbon emission on top of that. So that it's been calculated, at least for the Southern Hemisphere, that the area planted to short-term rotation forestry would have to be doubled roughly every 20 years just to maintain the original carbon storage. So this is not a solution for emission reduction for countries looking to meet their emission reduction targets. Certainly we do need forestry for other benefits. We need timber, we need paper. We discovered earlier this year that we all very desperately need toilet paper, and all those things that come from forestry. And as Minister Hackett mentioned in her presentation earlier today, if we have agroforestry where we have trees that are going to be there permanently and used for other, for the production of food, then that's a very, very positive benefit. I'm not saying that trees don't have positive benefits. I'm saying that short rotation forestry is not a solution to emission reduction. So there is zero net carbon sequestration benefit from harvested timber. In fact, it's actually, as I said, contributing carbon to the atmosphere. So if we want to mitigate climate change, we have to have a carbon capture and storage option that increases biodiversity, which is one thing that plantation timber does not do. It has to support cultural values, and there are lots of issues with in regional areas where what the pre-existing culture has been replaced by plantations, which very much change the structure of rural communities. And we need long-term removal and storage of carbon from the atmosphere. So in order to meet all of those, all of the things that we want to do through carbon capture and storage, we have to have an alternative, and forestry is not it. So let's look at soil as a carbon sink. So soil is by far the largest terrestrial sink for carbon, and the world's topsoils hold 3 times as much carbon as the vegetation, and that's when we're just looking at the top slice of the soil. If we take subsoils into account, that figure actually doubles. And there's been plenty of information about this around the world, but the best one was probably the Jabagi and Jackson study, where they analysed 2,700 soil profiles from around the world and found that in grassland soils, 42% of the carbon was in the 0 to 20 centimetre increment, and 58% of it was in the 20 to 100 centimetre increment. Now, this is important because a lot of measurements that are done on soil carbon are done 0.10 or 0.15 or maximum usually 0.20. And really we need to be looking at the whole of the top metre of the soil when we're looking to see what the sequestration potential of soil is. So we've only really scratched the surface, so to speak, in terms of looking at what soil carbon can do. And subsoils contribute more than half of global soil carbon stocks, and this is where we need to be looking to significantly increase our carbon storage. So the carbon that is stored below 30 centimetres is actually the sequestration of significance. It's more stable than topsoil carbon, and it also has many benefits for landscape function in terms of things like mitigation of floods and droughts. And it's very important also for farm productivity. So especially here, I guess in Australia, just talking to farmers who have been increasing their subsoil carbon, they've said that, you know, their plants are able to get roots down into that because the carbon holds water. There'll be stored water at depth, and it dramatically improves drought tolerance. But we also see that in times of heavy rainfall, if we have deep carbon, then we have deep storage for water as well, so that it stops that water from running off and creating floods. It also improves the mineral density in plants, animals and people, because roots are down there actively foraging for the trace elements and things that are so missing in today's forages and today's food production system. We around the world are noticing lack of trace elements in the food chain. So deep carbon is very important for nutrition as well. So has anybody received carbon credits for increasing soil carbon? Well, the answer is yes. And I'm very honoured to say, or proud to say, that this has happened in Australia. So on the 14th of March last year, we had the world's first and Australian first soil carbon credits. And a farmer by the name of Niels Olsen was issued carbon credits for sequestering soil carbon. And this is under a regulated scheme. This is a regulated government scheme that actually contributes to Australia's emission targets under the Paris Agreement. So it's probably the most scrutinised of the carbon credit schemes that are operating around the world. So Australian carbon credit units, called ACCUs, were actually issued under the federal government's emission reduction fund, which this year was renamed the Climate Solutions Fund. Every year they seem to come up with a different name for it. And the soil profile is actually measured down to 1 metre, and this is very important. It's measured in 2 increments. One is 0 to 30 and the other is the 30 to 100 centimetre increment. And the largest increases are being observed in this 30 to 100 centimetre increment. So this is really relevant for stable carbon storage. If people are saying soil is not it's not a useful carbon sink because, you know, carbon can fluctuate. Well, it will fluctuate in topsoils because the carbon that is there is generally regarded as being what we call labile carbon, whereas the carbon that's sequestered at depth is a much more stable polymer. It's undergone a lot of microbial transformation, and once it's there, it can be there actually for thousands of years, not just hundreds of years, but thousands of years. So there's a huge difference in the longevity and the stability of carbon stored at depth in soil compared to carbon in short rotation forestry, which, as I said, will only be there for even less time than it took to grow the trees. So what did Niels Olsen, what was he paid for? Well, he's had 2 carbon payments now. In 2019, the first carbon payment anywhere in the world under a regulated scheme. He was paid for 11.2 tonnes of CO2 per hectare, and that was sequestered in a 12-month period. And then this year, he sequestered another 13.7 tonnes of CO2 per hectare. And he has been monitoring it himself over time, and every year it is getting better. So in the first year when he changed his land management, he sequestered about 2 tonnes, and then the next year 4, and then 8, and it took him about 3 years to get to this 11.2. So this challenges another myth that we have about soil carbon, in that the so-called experts will tell you that soil becomes saturated and can no longer absorb carbon. But Niels was saying, I was just talking to him on the phone this afternoon, and he was saying that the more carbon he sequesters in his soil, the healthier it becomes, the better aggregated it becomes, the deeper it becomes, and the more carbon it is able to sequester. It's actually very difficult to get carbon into compacted soil that doesn't have good levels of biological activity. So it's all about increasing the biology in the soil and enabling it. It's like how grass grows grass, or carbon builds carbon. So 2/3 of the carbon that was sequestered in his soil was actually calculated by the science experts who used to say that root exudates didn't count. They were unable to figure out how he had stored so much carbon in his soil unless it actually came from root exudates. So about 1/3 was from just the decomposition of plant roots, and the other 2/3 was from root exudates that have been stabilised in the soil. And I've spoken about root exudates before. If your plants are producing root exudates, you will see soil sticking to the roots like this. Now, I've included this photograph. This is a new photograph. This was taken in winter, in the middle of winter here in Armidale, where I live. We had 4 lots of snow prior to me taking this photograph. It was cold, it was wet, and it is a myth to say that you will only get these rhiza sheaths forming on roots when it's hot and dry, because we certainly had a very cold, wet winter this year. So here is the seed and the seminal roots and the crown roots. They all have rhiza sheaths. So you need to see rhiza sheaths on your roots in order to know that your plants are actually going to be sequestering carbon and building soil. So here's another example. Here is the seed. This is a little wheat seedling, and these are the seminal roots. They're getting down very deep very quickly. The plant's only got 2 leaves at this stage. We've got rhiza sheaths. This one is from Canada, again, a cold climate. So what would be happening inside those rhiza sheaths is we have all this amazing biological activity, all these fungal hyphae, all these exudates, literally trillions of bacteria in here, and of course they're all feeding the plant and building soil. And this is what happens inside a rhiza sheath, and this is why they are so important. And plants don't have access to that absolutely extraordinary rhizosphere microbiome if they're grown under conditions that disable it. And in previous presentations and at BioFarm last year, I talked about the conditions that disable this. And the conditions that disable it are use of synthetic fertilisers, high analysis N, high analysis phosphorus, and low diversity pastures or low diversity crops. So monocultures and lots of synthetic fertiliser will disable the ability of plants to build soil carbon. So if we want soil to be a carbon sink, then we have to understand what it is that builds soil. So this is taken from one of Neil Olsen's field days. Hundreds of Australians have become interested in what he's been doing and how he's been building carbon. If I was able to show you a close-up of that, you'd notice that almost everyone's wearing a beanie and they're all wearing jackets. So we could be in Ireland, except for the fact that the trees are Australian trees rather than Irish trees. So it does get cold and wet here. Now this, in the middle of this photograph, I think my next photo is actually a close-up of that. This is actually a rig that goes all the way up to here. I hope you can see the pointer. This is the hydraulic soil corer that is going to drive a stainless steel tube down into the soil to actually take a core sample down to 1 metre. So this is how soil sampling is conducted. Sometimes they're on a trailer, sometimes they come on big trucks. And the idea is that we're going to take a whole lot of intact soil cores, which will be later divided up into the increments. And also we need to measure the bulk density of the soil. In other words, we need to know how much soil there is per unit area so that we can calculate how much carbon is in there. And this is the method that Niels Olsen has been using to increase his soil carbon. He has developed this machine called a soil key renovator, which he uses to plant his multi-species pastures. So he's planting these kinds of pastures, but he is continuously planting and replanting because the most exudates that come out of plant roots are in the early stages of growth. So the idea is that you would grow something and graze it to stimulate exudation, because grazing stimulates exudation. And then at some stage you're going to incorporate it once you've had several grazings out of it. And note the diversity. We want to have as much diversity as possible because that's very, very important. And I talk more about that on Thursday, about how plant diversity actually stimulates the microbiome. And then that's going to be incorporated. Seems a shame, I suppose, but you're feeding the soil, feeding the microbes, and you've already, so here we have our diverse crop over here, and he's running over it again with the soil key renovator. He's mulching that in. It's like a strip tillage kind of a machine, and it's going to 20% of the material is actually going to be mulched into the soil, and the other 80% is just going to be laid down flat. So that feeds earthworms, stimulates the soil microbiome. It is not true that we do not want to have zero soil disturbance, but we don't want to have 100% soil disturbance either. So 20% seems to be about ideal. And he repeats this process of diversity, grazing, incorporation, and repeating it and building soil very, very quickly. So what do we actually need to know about managing soil as a carbon sink? Obviously, we can't just continue with business as usual. In other words, if we were looking at the Irish example, and a dairy pasture, just to use that because dairy has been like a large industry for Ireland in recent years, and we will see ryegrass, or sometimes ryegrass and clover, and we'll see massive amounts of nitrogen fertiliser. Well, that is absolutely not going to build soil carbon. I can guarantee that it will not act as a carbon sink. So if farmers want to be paid carbon credits or to receive carbon credits, or even if they just want to get the benefits from having soil as a carbon sink, which is financially beneficial to farmers anyway because of increased productivity, increased animal health, and far less issues with things like, stock bogging up pastures and those kinds of issues, then they need to change from monoculture and fertiliser, and it will be financially beneficial to do so. So the emphasis is actually on appropriate management. Not all soils can be a carbon sink. So it has to be holistic. In other words, we have to think about everything in the environment. And when we have a biodiverse pastures, for example, then it's beneficial for insects and birds and everything else that lives in the environment, as well as the people and the livestock. I think Greg Judy is probably going to be talking more about holistic grazing, and maybe Alan Savory will say something about it. You never know what Alan's going to say, so I'm not sure. But it must enhance biodiversity. If it doesn't enhance biodiversity, it's simply not going to work, because biodiversity is fundamental to everything that happens, whether it's on farm or not. And we have to put microbes front and centre. So we don't want to be killing things with pesticides and insecticides, and in fact, and fungicides. We won't need those things. When we have a biologically active soil, we will not need to use any of those poisons. They're just symptoms of a system that's out of balance. If we have pest and disease problems, it's a symptom. So the biodiversity is a key factor in the effective functioning of all living systems, including our own. Biodiversity in the human gut microbiome is absolutely essential to our health as well. Now, I have mentioned the Jena biodiversity experiment before, but I just want to go over this again because this was a 15-year biodiversity experiment, and the results that came out of it have proved to be foundational really for just about everything else that's happening around the world. So they compared what would happen if you had 1, 2, 4, 8 or 16 plant species. It was a very simple design, but the important thing is there was 4 functional groups. So if you had 4 species, 8 or 16 species, they were from 4 functional groups. So 16 plants wouldn't be 16 different kinds of grasses or 16 different kinds of clovers, or it would be 4 plants from each of 4 functional groups. And one of those functional groups was grasses, the other one was legumes, then the other one was tall herbs like non-leguminous herbs, so say like chicory or something like that, and short non-leguminous herbs. And it's really important to have those herbal species in there and for them not to be legumes. So we want, so in the Irish situation, you'd be looking at things like your chicory and your plantain and sheep's parsley and those sorts of things that are not legumes, but they are very beneficial herbs, and they're absolutely essential to the soil building process and also to animal health. So in the ENA experiment, they looked at biomass production, they looked at beneficial insects, they looked at soil microbial activity and water balance and soil carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus, a whole lot of things that, that they investigated in that experiment. And this is like an aerial photograph of the area where they were working, and these plots were 20 metres by 20 metres, and they might have had 1 species in there, 2, 4, 8 or 16 different species. And what they found was that the biomass increased as the number of plant species in the mix increased. So as you went from 1, 2, 4, 8 or 16 different kinds of plants in a mix, the biomass was almost like a straight line relationship. Now, if you have livestock, that's really important. If you've only got ryegrass, you're down here. And if you've got ryegrass and clover, you're here. So why not have your chicory and your plantain and your and other herbs in there, and you will produce more biomass, which means it's going to be more beneficial for you economically and production-wise, as well as building carbon. There is no way you can build carbon down here. So the biomass is related to the number of species, as well as a whole lot of other things, like the need for nitrogen. So there's been several Irish studies that have also shown the same trend, and that is that diversity replaces nitrogen. So once we get over 8 species, for example, we will find that pastures will be more productive with no nitrogen than they will be with 200 kilos of nitrogen per hectare per year. So when we only have 1 species like ryegrass or 2 like ryegrass and white clover, then there will be a response to nitrogen. But the reason that nitrogen is used in those low diversity situations is that it is in fact replacing soil function. It's used as a surrogate for function. Once we get over 8 plant species, we have functional soils. We do not need fertilisers anymore. In fact, they are a detriment to the system. So we need to look at diversity, and we have to remember that high diversity actually will produce greater yield than high N. And the high diversity plots, if they had 8 or 16 different kinds of plants in them, accumulated 21.8% more carbon than the low diversity plots. So that's where it's really important, is that if farmers, for example, were receiving carbon credits, then high diversity would not only give them more biomass, would produce better animal health, would produce deeper soil, would be beneficial for insects because a lot of those plants have flowers, and beneficial for birds because they're beneficial for insects, and birds are often a very good indicator of how well the whole farm is functioning, but they're also going to build more carbon. So it's really, you know, it's a win-win-win-win-win situation here in terms of what biodiversity can do for a farm. And it builds deeper soil. So this is just a screenshot from a little video that the Jena experiment produced, and here we have 2 species that could be ryegrass and white clover, for example, can only ever build shallow soil, whereas when we've got 8 different kinds of plants together here, it will build deeper soil. Now this difference between this one and this one, this is our carbon, this is our sequestration of significance, because this carbon down here is very, very protected. It's not going to decompose. It's not going to go back to the atmosphere. It's going to be great for storing moisture at depth, which means if we just have shallow soils like this, when it rains, the water's just all going to sit around the surface and cause waterlogging and bogging. And then when we run into a dry period, this is all dry down here. So there's no moisture for plants to use in a dry time. So it's very beneficial for many reasons to build deep soil. So just to give you an example now from another country, I gave you an example from Australia. One of my favourite carbon capture farms is Jenny and Maya Smith Willow Farm at Artimuri in the North Island of New Zealand. And they have a minimum of 8 species. In fact, they've got a 12-way mix in their pastures, and they have at least 4 functional groups. And this is a photograph of one of their paddocks that's been changed to a multi-species mix. And this was a field day. I think we had over 100 people here at the field day, and everyone's just trampled all over this, and now they're walking back down the hill back to their cars. But what I want to show you here is this is a diverse pasture here. We have ryegrass here in the middle ground, and the hills in the back here are all plantation forestry hills. This is considered, or was considered, hopefully there's been a changed view by the New Zealand government to be best management practice, and there was a big move to actually convert farmland to forestry. This hill is completely naked. It is completely bare. It has been stripped of all of its timber. It has been clear felled, exposing the soil to erosion, and it's a catastrophe. I mean, how that could ever be promoted as best management practice, and yet the government continues to pour money into forestry, and they have a 1 billion tree program currently in New Zealand to plant 1 billion trees, theoretically to mitigate emissions, when in fact there is no net sequestration anyway, and still ignoring the huge benefits that can be attributable to multi-species pastures and having deep carbon storage. So we now have some data from this farm, like comparing what's happened to the soil under this multi-species sward to the soil over here underneath the ryegrass. This is another photograph from the same area. So these paddocks that you can see in the middle ground now that were all ryegrass have since been converted. Maya couldn't stand having just ryegrass there now that he sees the benefits of this. So all this land has now been converted. You can still see this poor bare hill here in the background. Here we have just like digging the soil and looking at the soil in the multi-species pastures. So this was originally like only a couple of centimetres of topsoil, and now it's all to the length of that spade. So just to look at what that looks like in terms of sequestration under the ryegrass pastures, the topsoil is actually relatively carbon rich in New Zealand. New Zealand is known for having relatively high carbon soils. And in fact, the scientists there have said soil carbon is not important for us because we can't increase it. Well, they're only looking at the top 15 centimetres. So there's only been like a 1.2% increase in the top 15 centimetres, so not very much change there. And that's one reason why people have said that it's not really important for New Zealand. But then when we look at these deeper layers, the 15 to 30 centimetre increment, it has doubled. There's double the soil carbon here in the diverse pasture compared to the ryegrass pasture. And then 30 to 45 centimetres, it's almost double again. So this carbon that has built here at depth will be safe from, it's going to be stable, in other words. And this is a massive amount of carbon. These changes here account to something like, depending on the bulk density of the soil, about 40 to 50 tonnes of carbon. So 40 to 50 tonnes that I think New Zealand pays about $30 a tonne. Work it out. It's thousands of dollars. It's actually thousands of dollars per hectare in carbon credits, and that would definitely be worth something for farmers to chase. So what future are we going to choose in agriculture? We have, it's very clear now what multi-species pastures can do. It's very clear what benefits are attributable to moving away from high analysis fertilisers. It's very clear that short rotation forestry, while it has benefits in terms of providing us with timber that we need and paper products that we need, it is not a sequestration option. So the choices that we have are, so in the foreground here we have dairy on a multi-species pasture. In the middle ground we have a monoculture of ryegrass, and in the background we have a hill laid bare from plantation forestry. So the choices are, in the foreground we have multi-species pasture nourishing healthy cows and sequestering deep soil carbon. In the middle ground we have monoculture ryegrass doing none of the above. And in the background, in the New Zealand case, the short rotation forestry is mostly Pinus radiata, it's destroyed topsoil and it's provided zero net carbon sequestration. So what are we going to choose? To me, the choice seems incredibly obvious. It's amazing that policy is not keeping up actually with what regenerative farmers are doing. So I was really, really impressed to hear Pippa Hackett talking about the fact that she was interested in multi-species swards, she was interested in biodiversity, and very interested in promoting these practices for Ireland. So that's my presentation. I've managed to get it within the time limit, even with a late start.
Well done, Christine.
So I'm ready for questions.
Well done, Christine. Really appreciate that, and well done again on another thought-provoking presentation. A couple of questions that pop into my mind. Niels Alston, I think, was the farmer you were referencing there, and he has been receiving payments, carbon payments, for the carbon he's sequestering. Do you know how much they're worth in terms of per tonne, or how is it calculated?
Yes, we have what's called a reverse auction system for carbon credits in Australia, which the whole carbon credits situation in Australia has been extremely interesting. It's really the federal government never really wanted to go there. So we had a carbon farming initiative that started in 2010, and they said they were going to pay farmers carbon credits, for soil carbon, I mean. And what happened was that all the carbon farming initiative money actually went into forestry with very perverse outcomes, and a lot of that forestry has now been pulled out. 10 years later, people have gone back in and cut those trees down because for a start they sucked up all the water and the streams stopped flowing and we ran into a drought, and then we had dry rivers wherever the plantations were, and so now there's special wording in the carbon farming initiative morphed into something else and morphed into something else, and then it became an emission reduction scheme, and now it's the Climate Change Solutions Fund or something. Every year they change the name of it and keep changing the rules as well. And they've got a reverse auction system. In other words, they pay the cheapest price that they possibly can for the carbon. Whoever puts in the bid for the lowest price is the one that the government will select. And at the moment, the price is around between $13 to $15 per tonne of CO2. Whereas in New Zealand, it's about double that price. And I think in other places, it's about 3 times that price. I'm not quite sure what the price is in Europe at the moment. I think it might be $25, something like $25 a tonne. Not sure.
Or maybe even €25, which would be the equivalent of maybe $50, could it?
Yeah, maybe it is. But it's much higher. We've got the lowest carbon price, in the world, I think.
Okay, so and he was literally getting paid, I think it was 11 tonnes last year and 13 tonnes this year, by whatever $15 per tonne, something like that.
So if you said, I've got my calculator here, so last year it was 11.2 times, what did I say 15, so about close to $170, something like that, around $170.
Okay.
So imagine if that was euros, it would be far, far more than $170 per. I mean, sorry, if he was being paid in another country like in New Zealand, he would be paid, over $300 per tonne, because that price is about twice ours.
Yeah, but maybe he should also consider himself lucky, because there's no farmer in Ireland that I know of has ever been paid a red cent for a tonne of carbon or otherwise. So be thankful or grateful for what is made available. You talked about a 16-way mix in a multi-species sward, and I think multi-species sward, you really zoned in on that area for farmers. Could you give us an example of what a 16-way mix might look like in Ireland? I mean, I know you mentioned chicory and plantain, and presumably there would be some grass. Would ryegrass feature as one of the grasses maybe in your 16-way mix?
It wouldn't on my farm. I'm not a fan of ryegrass, but and the thing about ryegrass is that if you've already had it, you will always have it. So even if you didn't put it in the mix, it would still show up.
Okay.
So it depends on whether you're talking about a permanent pasture or whether you're talking about putting in an annual mix to try and, if you had really degraded soil and you were trying to what we call prime it, restore it or rehabilitate it in the shortest amount of time possible, then annual plants are going to do that for you faster than perennial plants because they exude a lot more carbon, they grow more quickly, and the point is that, like what Niels Olsen is doing, is actually he will probably have 3 or 4 swards of annual plants every year. Like he's really pushing the system to maximise carbon storage. And in our Australian system with our very, very degraded soils, I guess there's plenty of opportunity for doing something like that. Whereas in the New Zealand system, and I'm not really quite sure what your carbon levels are like in Ireland, like where you're starting, but New Zealand is already starting from a high base in terms of their topsoils already have high, it's quite common for New Zealand topsoils, for example, to have like 10% carbon. So there's no point really in putting a whole lot of annuals into a system like that. They might as well, the soil is already primed, it's already ready. So they can go into their a perennial mix, as Jenny and Maya Smith was, they had a 12-way mix. But I mean, your 16-way mix would really be, if it was going to be annuals, you'd probably have, just a basic 16-way mix would probably be 4 grasses, 4 legumes, 4, and then 8 other non-leguminous things, so that the sorts of things that might grow in Ireland would include things like, just trying to think of annual things, so, be things like your brassicas, your turnips and your mustard and your radishes, and like there are how many brassicas are there? There's probably like 10, 15 different kinds of brassicas you could grow.
And then you, sorry for cutting across you, Christine, but you talked about tall herbs and low herbs, and the tall herbs you mentioned chicory and maybe plantain, but low herbs, what had you in mind in relation to those?
Well, I was thinking when I was thinking of perennial pasture, I was thinking chicory would be a tall herb and yarrow is another tall herb. And I know people don't particularly like yarrow, but the thing is, it's got very deep roots and it does help to build soil. And it doesn't matter whether stock eat these things or not. If you've just got a low percentage of them in the pasture, they are going to be building soil, and they're great for drought tolerance, and they bring minerals up from depth and all of that. We sort of, we've focused on like a ryegrass pasture that animals mow down, and we have this silly 3-leaf sort of grazing stage. If it gets to 4 leaves, you've left it too long, and then you've got to graze it down, and if the cows haven't grazed it short enough, farmers will come in and top it or mow it or do something. And we have to change all of those ideas that we have about grazing management and think about.
There's this concept about percentage utilization of the biomass that you grow above the ground. You say forget about it, just grow it.
Well, no. You still want to. Well, if you were a dairy farmer, for example, we'll just use that as an example because we've just concentrated on one industry. You will produce a lot more milk and you'll produce a lot more biomass if, when you bring the animals in to graze, for number one, you want to have at least 8 species in that pasture, and number 2, you only ever want to take 50% of the leaf area out at each graze. And in a growing season, you'll produce 60% more biomass, and you will produce probably 60% more milk as well. It's incredible, this idea that we have of of growing one kind of plant like ryegrass and then grazing it right down to the ground, because we think that leaves are wasted if we don't graze them. We just really couldn't have it more wrong if we tried. And I know it's hard when you think of it like that to imagine something different. And you probably need to go on a farm where people are managing it different and look to see. So if you looked on Willa's farm, for example, on Jenny and Maya Smith's farm, the ryegrass that's in there, when the cows go in, the cows will be up to their bellies in forage, legless cows we call them, and the ryegrass will actually be seeding when the cows go in, and they're not even taking any notice of it. They'll be grazing the leaves on the chicory and other things, and their milk production will go up and their butter fat will go up. And
so the biomass that they're not grazing gets kind of trampled, and it then becomes part of the soil. that you're building?
It becomes part of that labile topsoil fraction, but what it does is feed earthworms. And they, for years and years and years, used to buy earthworms and bring them in, put them on the farm, and they could never find them again. They'd go looking for them and they'd never found them. And then when they changed from ryegrass, fertilised ryegrass, to non-fertilised multi-species pastures, they've now got like 20 earthworms per spadeful of soil, and increasing every time they look, they're getting more and more earthworms. So the earthworms have come in because of the fact that now there's a lot more organic matter in the soil, like as well as root exudates and all those kinds of things. They're just decomposing roots and decomposing and stuff that's been trampled, and you've got good soil coverage from trampled litter, and yeah.
Okay.
And so the thing about the soil key method that the Australian farmer is using, he's actually using a machine to incorporate multi-species swards back into the soil to actually feed earthworms. They're seeing huge numbers of earthworms as well.
Yeah, that was when you showed the pictures of that machine that was basically mulching the vegetation back into the ground. Why not just let the animals do it for him?
Well, he's trying to speed up the process, I suppose, and it's he's probably turning it into, you know, the top 10 centimetres of soil. It's quite a vigorous action. Like the strip tillage that he does is really quite vigorous. If you look at the machine, you know, it really does some cultivation in the narrow strips that it does. It really turns in all that green stuff is mulched into the soil.
Yeah, but the farmer in me is thinking, well, hang on, I didn't grow that stuff to feed the soil. I grew all that material, well, at least a good chunk of it, to feed my stock. It feels like it's effectively a cover crop that he's growing, that he's growing it to just feed the soil.
Oh no! He will graze it. Yes, he's getting like huge amounts of grazing off it. I mean, there's a lot of if people wanted to look it up on the internet, it's called the Soil Key, SOILKEE, renovator, and there's lots of farming groups in Australia have done demonstration trials with it and found improvements in animal fertility, in lamb growth rates, in cattle growth rates, in earthworm numbers and soil carbon and all of the minerals in the soil like phosphorus and sulfur and magnesium and the trace elements and everything, like all the soil tests that have been done. It's really quite a revolution in thinking about farming. It's probably, you know, we've gone down this pathway of not wanting to disturb soil and also, I guess, not like he's combined a whole lot of things together in one machine. And I mean, I'm not really trying to sell his machine. What I'm saying is that he has been awarded these. He's the only farmer in Australia to date who has received carbon credits because he is building massive amounts of carbon in his soil. And when you see the soil profiles, like when you see what comes up in those coring tubes, when you take a soil core and pull it out and you lay it out, sort of looks like a broomstick kind of a thing, you can actually see where the carbon is. It's massive. You know, it's dark all the way down.
Am I right in thinking the machine, and we'll move on from this now, but the machine was also tickling the top or cultivating the top couple of inches of the soil? Would that not release carbon from the soil? I mean, would it be it seems counterintuitive in my head anyway.
Well, it does seem counterintuitive, but it's only disturbing 20%. So there's like it's like strip tillage. So there's like a certain amount is tilled, and then there's the pasture is left completely untilled between the strips. So you know, of every 30 centimetres, say, only 20% of it or less than 20% of it is actually tilled and the rest is left intact. You know, you're not turning all of it in. And if we go back to look at the Australian landscape prior to European settlement, we had a lot of small native ground foraging mammals that were constantly churning the soil over, looking for things like beetles and earthworms and fungal fruiting bodies. And we had, you know, animals like bettongs and potoroos and bilbies and bandicoots and all sorts of things that were not grazing animals that were turning the soil over all of the time. And when Europeans arrived in Australia, they found the soil was incredibly soft. In fact, it caused a lot of damage to the fetlocks of horses, and people complained about the fact that the soil was so soft and the horses stumbled all the time. And, you know, when you're trying to pull a wagon through the soil, it just left really deep ruts, not because it was wet, just because it was so soft. We had incredibly soft, deep soils of 20 to 30% carbon content, and now it's all just washed away. We're all farming on subsoil now in Australia, and we've got very high bulk densities and very low carbon levels, but it wasn't like that 200 years ago. So it was that actual soil disturbance was important. I think we've gone too far in thinking that soil disturbance is not a good thing. 100% soil disturbance, like turning everything over with a moldboard plough, is definitely not good. But leaving it totally undisturbed is not good either. It needs a certain amount of disturbances. There's an ecological hypothesis called the intermediate disturbance hypothesis that says it's like a bell curve, and one end of it is zero disturbance and the other end is too much disturbance, and it's like, you know, the Goldilocks principle. There's a sweet spot in the middle there where a little bit of disturbance is good, and he's disturbing 20% of the soil and it seems to be working. He's building carbon probably faster than anybody else in Australia anyway.
Okay, and that's independently verified, I presume, the amount of carbon that he's building?
Yeah, that's what I mean. It's a government regulated scheme. And in fact, all of the experts that said it wasn't possible have been scratching their heads and can't work out where the carbon has come from. So, you know, the way that it's measured is like it's been measured to the nth degree with the nth, you know, incredible amount of precision and all replicated, and everything is government supervised. And believe me, the scientists that were overseeing this have said repeatedly for the last 20 years, it is not possible to build carbon in Australian soils. So their egos were at stake, their reputations were at stake. They did not want to find soil carbon there. They didn't go looking for it. And then when they did find it, it was like, well, how did that get there? And they actually had to admit that 2/3 of it came from root exudates, after telling me for the last 20 years that roots don't even produce exudates, and don't be silly, you can't possibly build carbon from root exudates, you know. So now they've actually publicly admitted, the government has admitted that it is root exudates that have built the carbon.
Okay, I want to bring in some of the questions that have come from some of the viewers around the country. Some of the names will be familiar to you. So this is a question from our old friend Jim Cronin. As plants mature in the field, does the root exudation mass become less refined to the naked eye?
I'm not quite sure what that means, but plants exude most carbon when they're young. Like, young plants need to establish a relationship with microbes in the soil. They need to feed microbes in the soil to get their nutrients. So the exudation is mostly in the young seedling stages. Once they switch over from vegetative to reproductive, they stop exuding carbon into the soil, because all they're going to do then is translocate minerals from within the plant to the seeds and flowers. So they'll mobilise nutrients from their lower leaves, for example, up into the seeds or up into the flowers. They're no longer taking anything from the soil once they've become reproductive.
Okay.
So no, there's no exudates once they're reproductive.
Sure. I've another question here from Janine Hazelhurst. An organic farmer obtains land that is magnesium and boron deficient. How would he or she, I presume, restore the soil to eliminate these deficiencies?
Okay, so they're probably deficient because they're lacking in biological activity. And just because, I realise this is an organic conference, but just because something is organic doesn't mean to say that it's necessarily stimulating biological activity. So the farmer would need to look at diversity and possibly even a little bit of soil disturbance to activate things.
Okay. From Nigel Gillis, how is the soil carbon measured? I find that my fields vary hugely. A sample in one place will be different to one a few feet away. So I guess Nigel is wondering, is the methodology for measuring carbon around the world the same? I mean, there seems to be various different ways of even measuring simple things, relatively simple things like phosphorus and nitrogen. So is carbon one that's equally debatable in terms of how it's measured?
Well, the Australian measurement scheme is incredibly complex, I'd have to say, and they're very thorough in the way that the whole farm will be grid sampled. for carbon, and then they're taking an average. The other thing is that although the top layer, like the top 10 centimetres, may be very variable, you'll find less variation at depth. And so, you know, sometimes like what you're seeing in the topsoil is just because there was a particular plant there, or there might have been some animal manure there, or depressions in the soil surface where more water collects or something like that will make a difference. So that's why your deep carbon is the important carbon. But the thing about people talking about variation in soil carbon is that that top bit is really just labile carbon that comes and goes anyway. So we're not really interested. I'm more interested in what happens below 30 centimetres. So from 30 centimetres down to a metre is where it's really important, and is possibly not looking at it that deep. The other thing is, if you go into a forest and take a really good look at the trees, you'll notice that probably the smallest tree in the forest compared to the largest tree in the forest is probably at least double the size. Like, there'll be huge variation in individual trees in a forest, but when people estimate how much carbon is being sequestered by a forest, it's an average. It's like, well, you take the smallest tree and you take the biggest tree and you average it, right? So, you know, so the same thing with soil is that you take lots of samples and you take them to depth. It must be measured to a metre, and it's really that an average. It's a grid sample across the whole of the land, and it's an average. Okay. So in fact, it's probably more accurate than forestry carbon, because that's only an estimate.
I'm conscious that we're running over time. We did have a late start though, so let's just work through two more questions, and then maybe we'll save. I've a second whole sheet of questions, but I know you're going to be back with us on, is it Thursday morning? You'll be joining the conference proceedings here again, Christine, so we might be able to come back to some of these questions. So very quickly, two more questions, and I give the two of them to you and you can take them then together. From Stuart and Connor, is the carbon payment based solely on the increased amount per year or the cumulative amount stored? For example, how many tonnes per acre need to be sequestered to be viable? There's kind of two questions in that. Actually, let's just hear your thoughts on that. So the first one is the carbon payment based on the increase year on year or the cumulative amount stored? And the second question is, how many tonnes per acre needs to be sequestered to be viable? Well, I guess that's how much profit you want to make.
Yeah, no, that's fine. So there'll be a baseline measurement to how much carbon you have to start with is your baseline. So you could have hundreds of tonnes of carbon there and it's not counted. Like, that's your baseline. So from that, you actually have to increase it in order to be paid, because you have to take extra carbon out of the atmosphere and sequester it in your soil, because it's an emission reduction scheme, right? So whether you start with 10 tonnes or 100 tonnes, that's your baseline, and then you have to increase it. So it's only the change in carbon that you're paid for, and with the cost of measurement and everything else that goes with it, you have to sequester around 1 tonne per hectare per year to make it viable. That's the figures that the latest figures that we've seen is 1 tonne per hectare per year. Well, if you look at what Jenny and Maya Smith have done, they've sequestered about 40 tonnes per hectare per year in New Zealand, I mean. But the Australian farmer was, so the other thing is there's a difference between a tonne of carbon and a tonne of CO2. So you get paid for taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So the price that we have in Australia at the moment of around about $15 per tonne is per tonne of carbon dioxide taken out of the atmosphere. So every 1 tonne of carbon that you sequester in your soil, which is like a tonne of solid material, has taken 3.67 tonnes of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And it's the 3.67 tonnes that you get paid for. So if you sequester 1 tonne of carbon in your soil, you get paid for 3.67 tonnes of CO2 at $15 a tonne is like, you know, $50 or something.
Sure. So if I understand you correctly, they take a baseline figure of carbon in the soil, and then every extra tonne that you sequester into that soil each year, you're paid for. Is there a point where the soil is full up, you know, that it doesn't have a lot of capacity to sequester a lot more?
Well, that's what people have said, because they've only looked at the top 10 centimetres or the top 15 centimetres. And as I said, that's labile carbon, and that will depend on where in the world you are, you know, what the environmental conditions are as to how much carbon you actually can store in that topsoil. But when you look at the full 1 metre profile, there is a lot of space down there for sequestering a lot of carbon, because most subsoils are fairly low in carbon, and it's going to be it's going to be thousands of years really before that's full. So there's plenty of upside to sequestering carbon down to 1 metre.
Okay.
So that thing about saturation just applies to the top 10 centimetres of the soil.
And is there a kind of an accepted level that soils are saturated at? I mean, I think you had figures there. Was it 6.6 or 7.7 tons maybe of carbon per hectare in the top, was it top 15, top 30 centimetres of the soil?
Yeah, the top 15 centimetres, that was a percentage, like around about 6 to 7%. And in that particular soil, that is round about what it will be. And that's why people think that it's saturated, because you could change it, you could do everything right, and you might increase it by 1%. And they say, well, that wasn't huge. But then when you see what can happen, how much you can change the subsoils, because they are, like, if in that particular example I gave, 0 to 15 was, let's just say 7. And then the next increment down, which was 15 to 30, was about 2 to 3%. And then the next increment down, which was 30 to 45, was around about 1%. So if you could make that 1% in the 30 to 45 centimetre increment, if you could take that 1% up to 7%, you're talking about hundreds of tonnes of carbon, and you're talking about thousands of dollars in carbon credits.
But is that actually physically possible, do you think, to get the carbon down that deep at that level of concentration?
Well, it's not possible with ryegrass and white clover because they're very shallow rooted. So we need to have plants with deep roots like chicory and yarrow and those kinds of things. And remember, it's the carbon that comes out of the root tips. So it's as deep as the root tips can get, that is where the carbon is going to be sequestered. So it is never going to happen in Ireland with a fertilised ryegrass clover pasture. I promise you, you will never increase carbon. So there has to be a change in species composition and species management, but that will be a benefit to animal nutrition as well. Okay. And to biodiversity in the landscape.
Gotcha. Okay.
As everybody's discovering.
Final question, because I'm very conscious of the time, from Rachel Hardiman. Is grass an essential functional group for building soil, thinking in terms of non-pasture context, e.g. horticulture?
In a horticultural situation, I'd say no. The only benefit, I think grass makes great lawns, and grass is good for structure in a grassland context, or if you were thinking of a horticultural situation, in a permanent situation, grass gives you some structure that you don't necessarily get with broadleaf plants. But depending on what kind of horticultural situation she's looking at, I think we really need to move away from grasses as much as we can. They're always going to be there. As far as I'm concerned, they're mostly weeds. And your original meadows, if you looked at your original Irish meadows 200 years ago, there were literally hundreds of species of flowers in there. Yeah. You know, think back to and if you go to some of the wild places now where in springtime when they're flowering, there's literally hundreds of species of flowers in there. That's the kind of biodiversity that Irish soils, thrive on. And grasses are a component of that, but we have made agriculture based on grass. We've got grass-based agriculture, and it's very simplified, and it doesn't work. It doesn't function.
Okay, well, plenty of food for thought as ever there from Dr. Christine Jones, and thanks so much again for your time.